Hebrews is a strange and difficult book. First, it seems to ramble on about things that are not exactly burning topics of discussion over breakfast or even bitterly debated on Christian blog sites. It begins with a complex discussion of angels and what God did not say to them, continues with a brief treatment of Psalm 95 and what rest really means, moves on to discuss some bizarre chap named Melchizedek whom Abraham stumbled across in the desert, and it goes on to talk about the furniture in the tabernacle and then ends with an exhortation to go outside the camp. Not exactly the kind of stuff that comes up routinely in conversation. Second, Hebrews has a different feel and texture compared to the Gospels and Paul's letters. Many in the ancient church thought that Paul wrote Hebrews. Unfortunately, that doesn't hold up because entering the world of Hebrews after a close study of Paul is rather like listening to Monteverdi after listening to Bach. We are in the same world, but the color is different. Or in the musical terms, the notes are similar, but they're being played on very different instruments. The strangeness and difficulty of Hebrews can be counterbalanced with its sameness and familiarity with the New Testament message as a whole. Ultimately, Hebrews is telling the same story as the evangelists, as Paul, Peter, and John the seer. And that is how the story of the world and of Israel has led up to a dramatic point, namely the establishment of the true worship of the one true God. Whereas the Old Testament provided the scaffolding and pointed ahead to God's intention to build a new Jerusalem, to form a multi-ethnic Abrahamic family, and to put the world to right. Hebrews declares that the scaffolding is eclipsed by the actual building, the fulfillment of the scriptural hopes in Jesus, the divine Son. For in Hebrews we find all the emblems of Israel's call and all the instruments of their vocation, the temple, the law, the covenant, the priesthood, and Mount Zion. Only now they are expressed in the Messiah and his people. Jesus provides everything that the Old Testament has, only better. A better high priest, a better sacrifice, a better altar, a better covenant, and a better city. We could summarize Hebrews this way: Jesus is better. The letter to the Hebrews is very probably designed to persuade Jewish Christians not to go back to Judaism. Presumably because many have felt the pressure to do so under the duress of persecution. I mean, you can see the attraction. Judaism represented a much safer social and legal option as an officially sanctioned religion, compared with the risk of being part of what was becoming an unpopular messianic sect. This explains the various exhortations to endurance and why the author recalls the audience's willingness to put up with intense harassment in the past on account of their faith. The authorship of Hebrews has always been a bit of a conundrum. There was a widespread belief in the Eastern Church that it was written by the Apostle Paul, and this was eventually taken over into the Western Church. But since the Reformation, the ascription of Pauline authorship to Hebrews has been largely rejected. Alternative proposals for authorship have included people like Barnabas, Clement of Rome, Apollos, even Priscilla. It would appear that the author was most likely a well-educated, second-generation, Greek-speaking Jewish Christian, well-versed in the Septuagint, familiar with Platonic philosophy, and possessed a good command of Roman rhetorical techniques and Jewish interpretive traditions. Broadly put, any date for Hebrews between 50 to 100 AD is possible. It appears that 1 Clement, written towards the end of the first century, alludes to several passages from Hebrews, which would give us a ceiling for the date of Hebrews sometime around 96 AD. The reference to Timothy provides a bottom floor for our date, since Timothy joined Paul in his missionary journeys sometime around 49 to 50 AD. Since the author invests so much time demonstrating the superiority of Jesus' sacrificial death to the Jewish cultus with its assorted rituals, one can't help but think that the author would have referred to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD if it had occurred round about his own time. Strictly speaking, the author's arguments about the tabernacle and the Levitical priesthood are suitable in an either pre- or post-70 AD context. However, the author does make one crucial remark about the obsolescence of the temple sacrifices. After declaring that the annual sacrificial offerings are ineffective to permanently purify and perfect the worshippers from sin, he adds, otherwise they would have stopped offering sacrifices, wouldn't they? The question demands an affirmative answer, and the assumption seems to be that these annual sacrifices have not stopped. This would favour a date before the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. The social situation of the audience in Hebrews is that they have previously been on the receiving end of persecution, though martyrdoms have not yet taken place. That fits well with the picture of persecutions experienced by Christians in Rome in the late 40s during the reign of Claudius. As for genre, Hebrews is basically a homily in letter form, written by a Christian leader from somewhere in Italy, to Jewish Christians in Rome, probably on the eve of the Neronian persecutions, perhaps in the late 50s or early 60s. The author urges his audience to remain steadfast in their faith despite opposition from wider society. And he tells them to hold on tightly to their confession because the one who announced the message to them is faithful.
The letter to the Hebrews is the most sustained New Covenant argument, taking passage after passage from Israel's scriptures and explaining that these texts pointed forwards to a coming fulfillment through which Israel's sacrificial system would become redundant. This message seems to be addressed to people for whom the Jewish world seemed safer, more familiar than the strange new world of the Jesus movement. The writer is explaining that such safety is an illusion, since through the sacrifice of Jesus, God has joined heaven and earth together in the new way for which the old world and the old covenant had been longing. The letter refers to the wilderness tabernacle rather than to the Jerusalem temple as such, so opinion has been divided as to whether it was written before or after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in AD 70. The writer, who remains anonymous, weaves his sophisticated discourse around four texts in particular. Psalm 95, he points out, was written when the Israelites were already enjoying rest in the promised land. But the psalm points on to another, further rest, which still remains. Psalm 110 speaks of a coming king who is also a priest, not in the line of Aaron, but according to the order of Melchizedek, the ancient priest to whom Abraham himself had paid tithes. Jeremiah 31 promised a new covenant which would take the place of the original Mosaic covenant and would accomplish what the Mosaic regulations could not, namely forgiveness of sins. Psalm 40, read as a prophecy of the Messiah, declared that God did not ultimately want sacrifices and offerings, but rather the free self-offering which Jesus has now performed. Hebrews chapter 11 then turns this complex argument into a single narrative, telling the story of Israel as the journey of faith leading up to Jesus himself at the start of chapter 12 and to the promise of the new creation, 12 verse 28. Hebrews is remarkable above all for its portrait of Jesus. Like the Gospel of John and the letter to the Colossians, the book draws on the Jewish traditions of creation and wisdom to insist that Jesus is the one through whom God created the worlds. He is massively superior to the angels, not least because he is the ultimate genuine human being, seen in Genesis and in Psalm 8, the one to whom all things are now subject. And the full humanness of Jesus is in fact a major theme here, both in the echo of Jesus' agony in Gethsemane, chapter 5, verse 7, and in his resurrection and ascension, through which, as the true high priest, he always lives to make intercession for his people. In his death, he has defeated the devil himself, since he offered the perfect sacrifice, not simply in being killed, that was only ever the prelude to the real sacrificial moment, but in the presentation of his lifeblood in the heavenly sanctuary as the cleansing agent which enables heaven and earth to come together and sinners to be forgiven. The letter repeatedly applies all this to people who are tempted to slide back into the more socially acceptable world of continuing Jewish piety. No, he says, you must press on, you must go on. Chapter 6, verses 1 to 12, and chapter 10, verses 19 to 39, provide some of the most bracing exhortations in the whole New Testament.
The epistle to the Hebrews contributes three principal things to the tapestry of Christian thought: Christology, hermeneutics, and atonement. First, Hebrews is a rich and powerfully laden exhortation to faithfulness that is so effective because it forces us to set our sights on Jesus, the one who leads us into God's presence through his once-for-all sacrifice. At the heart of the theology of Hebrews is its Christology. At the head of the letter, we learn that Jesus, the Son of God, is superior to the angels. There were some in the early church who thought Jesus was a sort of special angel. No, says the writer, he is of a different order altogether. But lest you get the wrong idea, Jesus is also totally and truly human, and he still is. Jesus is our man in heaven, the one who lived our life and died our death, and has been exalted and glorified precisely as a human being. God has put a human being at the helm of the universe. Thereafter, Old Testament images abound as they are applied to Jesus by the author. Jesus is the true Joshua who leads the people of God into the promised land. Jesus is the true high priest from the order of Melchizedek, not Aaron, who unites the messianic and priestly offices in his own person. Jesus is not a transient priest, rather he remains a priest forever. Jesus is the offerer of a new sacrifice in his body and the arbiter of a new covenant. The great cloud of witnesses are the cheer squad who urge us on to run the race of faith and to follow after Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Then, at the very end of the letter, we learn that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. He's the great shepherd of the sheep, the one brought back from the dead. Second, Hebrews is immensely important for hermeneutics, as it shows us a new way of reading the Old Testament. The point, of course, is that the Old Testament is an unfinished story. Much like an incomplete highway under construction, the Old Testament points ahead to its final destination, but without actually having enough bitumen to take you there. The argument of Hebrews is that the Jewish scriptures are continually pointing beyond themselves to a future reality which they do not contain. More particularly, they are pointing to a great day of salvation, of dealing with sin, which they do not themselves offer. This great act has now been accomplished in Jesus. Therefore, readers of Scripture must follow this Jesus. Third, a final feature of Hebrews is that the letter emphasizes the sacrificial death of Jesus as God's deal-making act to reconcile the human race. The sacrifices of the Old Testament were designed to highlight the seriousness of sin and the holiness of God. Of course, a theology of Old Testament sacrifice is complex, but behind it stands these ideas of representation and exchange, life for life, blood for blood. For the author of Hebrews, the Old Testament sacrifice made one outwardly clean, but not inwardly clean. Neither did they really affect a change in circumstances, as it is impossible for the blood of goats and bulls to take away sin. But the Old Testament points to God as the one who provides the sacrifice. God first did this in slaughtering an animal so that Adam and Eve had clothes to cover their nakedness. And he did it again in providing a ram for sacrifice in place of Abraham offering up Isaac. Hebrews argues that Jesus is the one true sacrifice to which all the others pointed. Jesus' own blood is a redemption that lasts forever, which can cleanse our conscience from dead works to serve the living God. In a nutshell, Hebrews offers us quite simply Jesus. It offers us the Jesus who is truly there to help because he's one of us. He has trodden the path before us. This book offers us Jesus who has inaugurated the new covenant, bringing it to its fulfillment in the age-old plan of God. And it points definitively to Jesus as the final sacrifice, the one who has done for us what we could not do for ourselves, who has lived our life and died our death, and now ever lives to make intercession for us. We come to worship, to prayer, we come to the Eucharist because we want this Jesus. So then, the author says, let us then come boldly to the throne of grace, so that we may receive mercy and may find grace to help us at the moment when we need it. And we go out gladly to follow this Jesus wherever he leads us, so that we can run the race that lies in front of us, and we run it patiently, looking ahead to Jesus. He is the one who carved out the path for faith. He's the one who brought it to completion.